8th grade math, final part. I wish I could tell you that things improved over Christmas break, but they only got worse. The first night of Christmas break, I went to sleep, only to have the most bizarre nightmare of my life. In my dream, Pedersen was just standing there in that same tacky suit he always wore. He just kept shouting, "Punishment." The thing is, it wasn't like a normal shout. It was like a screech. Very loud, very shrill. I woke up almost immediately and I was terrified. It took nearly an hour to get back to sleep, and as soon as I did, I had the same nightmare. Needless to say, I didn't sleep that night. Since I couldn't sleep, I went out to the living room to play some snares and calm my nerves. My dogs, I had 2 Labradors, instinctively followed me and sat on the couch on either side of me. I just sat there in the dark, playing Super Mario World with the sound muted, so I wouldn't wake my parents. Now, our living room had a big front window. It took up a pretty good deal of the wall, and gave a great view of the yard and the street out front. At night we'd always keep the curtains drawn. Suddenly, both my dogs jumped off the couch and rushed over to the window. They kind of pushed under the curtain and just started barking and hopping up on the window with their front paws on the glass. I had no idea what was going on. My chocolate Labrador liked to go out through the doggy door to our backyard and bark, but they never just went to the window and barked like this. I ran over to the window and looked out to see what was happening. There was a pickup truck in the middle of the street, right in front of my house. It looked a lot like Pedersen's truck. I couldn't see the driver, but it was enough to freak me out. Naturally, my parents came out of their room pretty quick, and they were pissed at me for being awake in the middle of the night playing games. I freaked out and tried to tell them that there was a truck parked in front of our house. My dad looked out of the window, since my dogs were freaking out, but the truck was gone. I guess it drove away when I turned to see my parents. That was the beginning of the really upsetting stuff. I was freaked out. I didn't sleep that night. I just tossed and turned. The next day I met Jamal at a Pizza Hut that was within bike riding distance of our neighbourhood. Our plan was to get some pizza and head back to his house and talk about the weird stuff. I told him about seeing who I thought was Pedersen outside. As we were leaving, I suddenly felt a lot of pressure on my knee. It was like someone was squeezing it, and naturally I went down quick, landed face first in the pizza and cursed up a storm. As Jamal helped me back up, that's when we saw him. Pedersen was in his pickup, parked on the other side of the parking lot and staring at us with the same cold, seething stare. Of course, I'd already hurt my knee the other day, so at this point it wouldn't be a stretch to think I was just over-exerting my injury. But I swear to you, it felt like there was a hand grabbing my knee and squeezing it. I ended up going home, staying in bed all day with my leg up and ice on my knee. The nightmares came back that night, and the next night. By the time Christmas break was over, there had only been a few nights when I actually slept. Christmas Eve and Christmas I was able to sleep through, and for a few days the nightmares only happened once or twice, but for the majority of our time off school, I had the nightmares. When school started up again, I was surprised to see Bethany was back. She didn't say a word to me all day, until lunch, when she got me and Jamal to follow her into one of the bathrooms. The 3 of us hid in the bathroom stall, and we soon found out Bethany had been having the same nightmares we had. Bethany was convinced that Pedersen was responsible for everything. I have to admit, the way she explained it, it was creepy. Jamal stole his Game Boy back, and then Jamal's Game Boy gets broken. I fake a knee injury to distract him, so Jamal could steal his Game Boy, and then I start suffering real knee injuries. Not to mention Bethany's mum yells at him, embarrassing him at his job, and she dies in a car accident. Of course, Pedersen hadn't actually done anything. The most he ever did was just stare at us. Bethany was convinced he had caused it all somehow. At this point, I believed her. Too much weird stuff had happened. Right as we're in the middle of the discussion, someone knocks on the stall door. I swear I hadn't heard anyone enter the bathroom. With 3 sets of legs under the stall, it was pretty obvious that something unusual was happening, but we thought we might be able to just stay quiet and keep the door locked. Suddenly the door opened. Jamal later swore to me that he had locked it, and I believed him. I'm sure it comes as no surprise that Pedersen was on the other side of the door. He stared at us. Then he just kind of smiled and said we were all in a lot of trouble. Well, we were. 2 boys and a girl, all known troublemakers, caught in a bathroom stall instead of being at lunch. The principal just assumed something sexual was happening. Schools are pretty strict about that stuff, and we all got in a lot of trouble. We were all suspended for 2 weeks. I got lucky that my dad didn't get too mad. He assumed that I was a curious 14-year-old, and really the worst of my punishment was having to have the sex talk again, and him telling me not to do that kind of stuff at school. Jamal wasn't so lucky. His mum freaked out and grounded him. No phone, no leaving the house. Bethany? Well, her dad was already a wreck. He took her mum's death really hard, and when he heard why she was suspended, and that it involved Jamal and I, who had become frequent guests at her place over Christmas break, he just assumed that we were trying to take advantage of her grief. We were forbidden from going over there, and worse yet, I found out Bethany's dad decided to move to Virginia, and they were going to leave immediately. Well, immediately meant a couple of weeks, but that was still really fast to just up and move. So I spent the next 2 weeks at home, hanging out with the neighbourhood kids. I didn't tell them about any of what was happening. Doubted they'd believe me anyway. One of my neighbours was named Matt. We'd hang out on occasion. We weren't super close, but Matt's dad was a big computer guy, so Matt had a lot of really cool games, and although it makes me sound terrible, I pretty much hung out with him to play with his stuff. I know, but I was 14, and I admit I was an asshole. I was hanging at Matt's house one day. It was after school hours, although I was still suspended. It was my turn to play on the computer, so Matt goes to walk his dog. While he's gone, I get up to use the bathroom, and suddenly my knee gives out. I feel the same squeezing sensation I felt at the Pizza Hut. I fell into the table, knocked over his computer monitor. I ended up banging up my left arm pretty bad and breaking the monitor. Matt comes back and he freaks out, starts yelling at me. He's pissed that I broke his dad's computer. I explained it was an accident, but he didn't care. He kicked me out and told me to expect his dad would be at my place when he got home. So I was walking home. Matt lived only 1 street over, and then I see him, Pedersen. He's sitting at the end of the street in his pickup and staring at me, and I knew that somehow, as strange as it sounds, he was making my knee hurt. He was squeezing my knee somehow without ever actually physically touching me. I freaked. I'd have to walk right by him to get home. I waited for him to leave, but he didn't. He just sat there on the side of the road, staring at me. After 10 minutes of this, I turned and just walked down another street. I didn't know where I was going. I just wanted to be away from him. I knew that if I got near his truck, something bad was going to happen. I couldn't get to Jamal's house since he lived on the other side of me. I decided to try and get to Bethany's. If you recall, she lived further than the neighbourhood where Jamal and I lived. It wasn't terribly far, but I was used to riding my bike down there. I'd never walked that far before, especially not in pain. Somehow I made it. Twice along the way I thought I saw Pedersen's truck behind me, but he'd turned down a side street whenever I turned round. I didn't have words to describe how scared I was. I was hurt, alone. It was getting dark, and my teacher was stalking me, and I was convinced that he had the power to hurt me without even touching me. And I should point out, I did not have a cell phone. I did not get one of those until I started college, so I had no way to contact my family, or the police, or anyone. I made it to Bethany's, and by the time I did it was dark outside. I knew Bethany's dad had forbidden me from coming over, but to my relief when I got there his car was gone. I knocked on the door, and Bethany answered. I told her what happened, and that I was pretty sure Pedersen was following me. She asked what I wanted to do. If we should call the police, but I knew they wouldn't believe us. We were a couple of 40-year-olds, known troublemakers, on suspension, and everyone assumed she was acting out over her mother's death. Even if we'd been honour roll students, would the cops believe that a teacher was somehow hurting me without ever touching me? Bethany told me they were moving soon. She was in tears, saying that she couldn't believe that Pedersen was going to get away with all of this. I told her I'd do whatever I could, but I didn't know what I could do. He was a teacher. Surely nobody liked him, but he still had more credibility than I did. I called my dad, had him pick me up. He was pissed, both because he knew I wasn't supposed to be at Bethany's house and because Matt's dad had called. Now I was in trouble, and I spent the rest of my suspension grounded. The nightmares kept coming. Some nights they wouldn't come and I'd sleep okay, but most nights I only got at most 3 hours sleep. Not 3 hours in a row, but 3 hours total. The rest was nightmares and trying to go back to sleep. By the time my suspension was over, I was a wreck. Bethany had moved away. Jamal was keeping his distance too. I guess his parents told him to stay away from me because they blamed me for getting him in trouble. So I was alone. Really. With so little sleep, my grades were falling. I started drinking copious amounts of soda for the caffeine since I wasn't sleeping well, and that made me start gaining a lot of weight. I sort of became alone, not talking to anyone, barely paying attention in class. By February, it was obvious something was wrong with me. My parents assumed I was struggling in school, and turns out the school started worrying about my home life. Mr. Hall, my science teacher, eventually had me go to his office at lunch. He asked me what was wrong, but I brushed it off. That's when he asked me a question that made my jaw drop. Does this have anything to do with Mr. Pedersen? I can't really describe what that moment was like. Like I said, I never thought of telling anyone about Pedersen, since I didn't think anyone would believe me. Now I had an adult, my beloved science teacher, asking me if Pedersen was part of the problem. So I just nodded. I wasn't about to tell him I thought Pedersen had been harassing me for months, or that I thought he had some kind of power to hurt me from long distances, or that I thought he had somehow killed Bethany's mother. Mr. Hall got this odd look on his face. He kept staring at me. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally told me that I should go to his house after school, that it wasn't safe to talk here, but we could talk there. Before everything with Pedersen, I would have been weirded out by a teacher asking me to their house, but if there was even a chance that Mr. Hall could help, I had to try it. I was alone and miserable, and I needed help. After school, I met him in the parking lot and went with him to his house. On the way, I thought I saw Pedersen's pickup behind us, but then I tried to tell Hall. He just shushed me and told me not to talk. I have to admit, I was terrified. Mr. Hall was a big guy. He had been in the army when he was younger, and he looked like he could still fight if he wanted to. When we got to his house, he ushered me inside and took me into his living room. He sat down and asked me to tell him what was really going on. I remember his exact words. Tell me the truth, even if you think it sounds unbelievable. If you lie to me, I can't help you. So I told him. Everything I have told you. I told him. He sat there totally quiet, not moving, not questioning, and never looking away. He didn't even raise his eyebrows when I told him how I thought Pedersen was hurting me without even being near me, or how I suspected Pedersen had killed Bethany's mother somehow. I sat there and I half expected him to call me crazy. Instead he patted me on the shoulder and thanked me for being honest. Then he told me that he believed me. I was amazed. Without thinking, I just blurted out, "Why?" And he told me. Apparently Mr. Hall used to teach at the same college where Mr. Pedersen taught. He said that he had never known Pedersen back then, aside from a few times they passed each other on campus. He also told me that there had been a couple of very strange accidents at the college. There had been a rash of vandalisms at the college campus. Some students were breaking into classrooms and spray painting things on the walls, breaking equipment, breaking into teachers' desks, stuff like that. The last classroom that was broken into was Pedersen's. 2 days later, 3 students, apparently drunk, crashed their car into one of the campus buildings. The students all died, and some stolen items from teachers were found in the trunk, along with spray paint in the back seat. They had been the vandals. The whole campus was horrified, except Pedersen, who Hall described as being exuberant in his happiness the day after the accident. Hall wrote it off as Pedersen being a weirdo. Later, the campus let several teachers go, Hall and Pedersen included. The next day, the administrator, who made the cuts, fell down the stairs. Hall and another fired professor had been waiting near the door to talk to him when he fell. They checked on him, and Hall went to get help. He said when he left the building, he saw Pedersen just standing in the middle of the ground staring at the building. He described the same cold, seething glare I had described Pedersen having. I was astonished as Hall finished the story. He told me that he and Pedersen both ending up at my school was just coincidence. He also told me that he had been keeping an eye on Pedersen ever since he saw the way he would always show up late and leave his class out in the cold. I didn't know what to say. I asked Hall how Pedersen could be doing this, and he told me he had no idea. That wasn't the answer I was hoping for, but it was nice to have someone, an adult, who believed me. Finally, I started getting worked up. I told Hall we had to do something. If he believed me, if he knew Pedersen was somehow responsible, then we had to stop him, go to the police. I figured they'd have to believe Mr. Hall. He was a teacher. He was a veteran. I was convinced the police would listen. Hall brought me crashing back down to reality. He pointed out that Pedersen hadn't done anything. He'd never actually laid hands on me, and there was no way we could prove the accident had actually been caused by him. Hall drove me home, told me to keep my chin up. Everything would be fine. I wasn't convinced. But that night, I didn't have the nightmares. I was convinced for the first time in a long time that maybe this would all work out. The next day, as I'm leaving Pedersen's class, he tells me to stay behind. I suddenly become a nervous wreck. Everyone else shuffled out, and the next period wouldn't be showing up until after lunch. Pedersen asked me why I had been at Hall's house. Now I was scared. I told him I hadn't been at Hall's house, and that's when my knee started hurting again. I fell to the floor. Pedersen was just glaring at me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. After a minute, the squeezing sensation stopped. Pedersen kind of shuddered, and then he spoke. He told me that he wasn't a fool, and that he knew I knew more than I should. He told me that I was clumsy, and that if I kept up this pace, I might have a serious accident. I knew what he was really saying. If I didn't stop poking my nose into his business, I was going to die. I asked him why me. What had I ever done to get on his shit list? I asked him why in my dreams he kept screeching punishment at me. His answer was not what I expected. I'm guessing it's not what you expected either. He said I was the perfect example of what was wrong with kids these days. That I was rude, that I had no respect for authority, that I was a troublemaker, a slacker, that kids like me were a disgrace. Now, I don't deny this charge. I was rude and a slacker. I had no respect for authority, that's all true. I was a 14-year-old boy. But it amazed me that that was his answer. That was why he was so mad. I hadn't done anything of real consequence. I hadn't hurt him in some way. I'd certainly made some pretty rude jokes about him. But everyone did. Apparently I wasn't anything special. I hadn't done anything more than anyone else. He just chose to single out me, Jamal, and Bethany. I guess he thought we were the worst of the students. Maybe we were, but none of us did drugs. I got in a couple of fights, and so did Jamal, but way less than some students. But somehow, to him, we deserved punishment. And instead of just failing us in pre-algebra, he was determined to make our lives hell. I didn't get a chance to respond to Pedersen's answer. The door burst open, and in came Hall. Before Pedersen could say a word, Hall grabbed him by the collar and thrust him up against the wall. Hall told Pedersen that he didn't care what he could do, that if Pedersen hurt another student, then Hall was going to relive his days in Vietnam on Pedersen's backside. Pedersen looked terrified. I kept expecting Hall's head to explode or something, but Pedersen seemed genuinely scared and helpless. Hall hit him in the stomach and told him to quit his job. Then Hall walked me to the nurse. I was astonished. That night I had no nightmares. The next day when I got to school, I found out that we had subs for both Pedersen and Hall's classes. We had those subs for the rest of the week. I wanted to go to Hall's house and see if he was okay, but it was too far to bike. The next week when I got to school, we got a surprising announcement. Mr. Pedersen was no longer going to be teaching pre-algebra. Apparently, he had taken a different teaching opportunity. I didn't have the nightmare again after that. Mr. Hall didn't get back to school for another 2 weeks. When he did, he had a scar on his face, on the brim of his nose, and another one on his neck. As soon as class was over, I asked him what happened. He just told me not to ask. He said it should be all right, that Pedersen was gone and he wouldn't be back. He told me to forget everything. After that, things got better, so much so that I really thought it was over. I was able to sleep again, my grades picked up, and I started losing the weight I'd gained. Best of all, we got a new teacher. She was always on time, she was a great teacher, and best of all, she wasn't vindictive, and didn't have any strange powers. Nothing else happened for the rest of the school year. Sadly, my friendship with Jamal never recovered, and I never saw Bethany again. Over the summer I got a girlfriend named Laura, and I became good friends with her brother Craig. One day when we were out riding our bikes, I suddenly felt that same squeezing sensation in my knee. I screamed and crashed my bike. I got pretty banged up. I didn't even care, just started looking round. Laura and Craig had run over to help me, but I was terrified and not paying attention to them. I looked round, and there he was. Pedersen's pickup was parked on the street, and he was standing in front of it. He had the same cold, seething stare as he looked at me. The next thing I knew, I felt the squeezing sensation again, but not on my knee. I felt it on my neck. He was choking me. I knew I was going to die. Craig and Laura were trying to help me, but they didn't know what was happening. I was blacking out. My chest was burning. I knew I was going to die. Then I heard a terrible sound. It was like thunder and a crunch of metal. The squeezing sensation stopped. I could breathe again. When I finally sat up, after a lot of coughing, I saw what happened. A car crashed right into the pickup. Pedersen was caught between the two vehicles. He was dead. It was Hall's car that crashed into him. I don't know how Hall knew to be there, but he had crashed right into Pedersen. Hall survived the crash, but ended up in a wheelchair from it. That was pretty much the end of it. I still have problems with my knee. A year later my parents split up and I moved away from Maryland. I've never been back. I still have no idea how Pedersen did what he did. I know it wasn't normal. You don't have to believe me. I wouldn't believe me if I hadn't lived through it. I'm just glad that I did live through it.